In a previous video we talked about news and how to identify what makes a story for the press. Today I want to look at how to write a press release. This is the way you get your information across to a journalist. You can contact journalists via social media. Often you'll see calls for articles on Twitter. But the best way is to write the journalist a short press release which explains your story. You can then email the press release and follow up with a phone call. So a press release is the way we structure a story to explain to the journalists what we have to tell them. And there's a set structure to follow. When you write a headline on your press release, it's really to capture the journalist's attention. More often than not, the journalist or the editor at the newspaper will come up with their own headline. But for the intention of attracting attention, it's a good idea to come up with an eye-catching headline of your own. The art of the press release is to get your story across to the journalists in as few words as possible. You want to grab their attention and let them know immediately what the story is about. If you've done your research, then it should be relevant to that particular journalist, and so all you have to do now is create an engaging story. When crafting your press release, the easiest thing to think about is who, what, when, where, why and how. So let's consider the who. Who's the story about? If it's about you or your company, you want to get that in the first sentence, if not the first few words, so that the journalist knows exactly who we're talking about at the start of the story. If you're writing for the local newspaper, it might be easier to start off with something like local man, local woman, or name the city or town in which you're from. This signals straight away to the journalist that it's a story of relevance to their local readers. You can then follow up in the second or third line with explaining exactly who we're talking about. Try and get your company name in the press release as early on as you can. So that's the who. So now we come to the what. What's the crux of the story? What is it that the story is about? So if you're launching a product or new service, you've won an award, you're doing something for charity, whatever the story is about, that's the what. So try and get that out in the second or third sentence. Journalists don't tend to write stories about things happening in the future. If you're trying to promote an event, you'll probably find there's a better way of doing it. So the when is usually this month, this year, recently, particularly if it's relevant to an award or something you've just achieved. As for the where, again, it needs to be relevant to the local journalist. So if it's about something that's happening in your town or village, then again that makes it highly relevant. If you're talking to a regional publication, then you want to be looking countywide. And of course, if it's national, then you've got to make sure your story is of big enough importance to be picked up by the national newspapers. So after you've summed up in the first few lines who it is we're talking about and what is the crux of the story, then you can go on to develop it in the later paragraphs. Explain exactly what you've done or are doing, the benefit to the readers, and why it's a story that's worth telling. You can then sum up with some contact details and how people can find out more. Remember, with a press release, you're telling a story. It's not an advert. You're not paying to have this published. So it needs to be newsworthy. So think about yourself. What do you like reading in your local newspaper? What would make an interesting story? And make sure you've ticked all those boxes. Once you've written your press release, think about a photograph that could go with it. Nowadays, as well as print editions, most journalists put press releases and news stories online, so they'll be expecting to have a decent photograph to go with the story. After you've emailed your press release to the journalist, the chances are they'll phone you up to have a chat. They may want to ask you some questions that you haven't covered in the press release, or just develop the story a little bit further. So make sure you're available in the hours and days following sending off your press release.